the debris field wasn't the part that confused fleet analyst Keth Soren. It was the coffee cup. Floating amid the wreckage of what had once been the outer sensor buoy at Threshold 7, tumbling slow in the vacuum between two shattered hull plates the size of city blocks, was a ceramic mug, white, chipped at the rim, still bearing the dark residue of whatever liquid humans drank to begin their mornings. It spun in perfect silence, untouched by the catastrophe that had reduced everything around it to slag and vapor and compressed geometric ruin, as though someone had simply set it down for a moment and intended to return. Keth Soren stared at it for 11 full seconds before she remembered to log it. The official report would later describe the Threshold 7 debris field as consistent with catastrophic internal detonation. What the report would not describe, what no official document produced by the Galactic Cooperative in the aftermath would ever fully address, was why the detonation pattern radiated asterisk outward from 12 distinct points simultaneously, in a configuration that the Cooperative's own blast modeling systems flagged as statistically impossible for any known weapons system, or why the field contained no human remains whatsoever, or why every piece of alien wreckage, every fragment of the 412 warships that had entered the Threshold 7 corridor 11 days prior, bore evidence of having been struck from inside asterisk. The Armada had been the largest military force ever assembled under a single command structure in recorded galactic history. Keth Soren had reviewed the assembly logs herself, because reviewing logs was what she did, had always done, with the quiet precision of someone who understood that truth lived in the margins of official records rather than in their headings. 412 warships, belonging to 7 separate species, unified under the Cooperative's joint military framework in what the diplomatic cables had called, with characteristic institutional self-congratulation, an unprecedented expression of collective resolve. What the cables had not said, though Keth Soren had read between every line, was that the resolve was fear wearing the costume of confidence. The 7 species had spent 18 months arguing about resource rights along humanity's outer boundary before anyone said the word that everyone was thinking. Before Executor Prime Davin Threll had stood in front of the Cooperative Council and said, in the flat, declarative tone of someone announcing a weather forecast, "The humans are not negotiating because they believe they have already won." Nobody in that chamber had disagreed. That was the part that should have given them pause. 7 species, representing civilizations spanning thousands of years of institutional conflict and philosophical disagreement, had looked at each other across the council floor and found, in that one assessment, total unanimous silence. They had launched the Armada 8 weeks later. "Tell me again," said Vice Admiral Prunkale, reading over Keth Soren's preliminary report from the doorway of her analysis bay. "What you mean by from inside?" She didn't look up from her display. The impact signatures on recovered hull fragments show lateral stress fractures consistent with pressure waves originating inside the affected vessels. Not outside, not from a projectile, not from a beam weapon, not from a mine, from within the hulls themselves. "That's not possible." "I'm aware of what it is and isn't." She finally looked up. "I'm telling you what the data says." Prunkale was quiet for a long moment. He was a Verath, broad and pale, with the slightly too wide eyes that his species used to convey careful thought. All 412. All 412. He left without saying anything else. Keth Soren turned back to the debris field imagery and looked again at the coffee cup, which she had flagged in the log as asterisk item 7C, personal artifact, human origin condition, intact. She had been doing this work for 22 years. She had processed the aftermath of 9 military engagements, 4 territorial disputes that escalated to violence, and 1 full-scale war between the Dret Consortium and the Haven Republics that had lasted 6 years, and left 11 star systems functionally uninhabitable. She had never, in 22 years, seen a debris field with no bodies. The first signal had arrived at the Cooperative's outer listening post 43 days before the Armada launched. Keth Soren had it now, pulled from the archive, translated, timestamped. Most analysts had categorized it as a diplomatic transmission and routed it to the political division. Nobody in the political division had forwarded it to the military planning committee. This was not, she suspected, an accident. The transmission was from a human administrator named Elena Vasquez, attached to the Human Territorial Boundary Commission. It was 6 sentences long. We are aware of the assembly at Docking Cluster 9. We understand what it represents. We want you to know that we have considered all of the options available to us and have made our decision. We are asking, one final time, for the resource negotiation to be resumed under the original framework. If the Armada crosses Threshold 7, we will not be able to guarantee the safety of its personnel. We are sorry for that. 6 sentences. Keth Soren read them again. What had landed in the political division's inbox as a standard diplomatic protest, phrased perhaps a shade too formally but otherwise unremarkable, looked, in retrospect, completely different. Not a protest, not a bluff, an apology. We are sorry for that. Past tense implicit in present framing. Not we will be sorry, not we would be forced to act. Sorry. As though the outcome were already established. As though the 412 warships were already gone and Elena Vasquez was expressing condolences for an event that, at the time of writing, had not yet occurred. Keth Soren marked the transmission with a priority flag and sent a request to the political division for any additional human communications from the same window. The response came back in 40 minutes. There were none. Elena Vasquez had sent one transmission, received no reply, and gone silent. What had she done in the 43 days between that transmission and the Armada's crossing of Threshold 7? What had the humans been doing while the Cooperative assembled 412 warships and moved them into position? That was the first question Keth Soren could not answer. The second was simpler and somehow worse. Who was Elena Vasquez? The Cooperative's personnel registry had almost nothing. Human systems analyst, boundary commission, mid-level administrative role. No military designation, no diplomatic rank, no security clearance that would justify sending a warning to the Cooperative Council on behalf of the human territorial government. She was, by every available record, a functionary. A person who processed forms and attended meetings and ensured that the machinery of bureaucratic continuity kept grinding. So why had she been the one to send the message? Executor Prime Daventhrel summoned Keth Soren to his command chamber on the 9th day of her analysis. She had expected the summons earlier, which told her something about how badly he wanted to delay what she might say. The chamber was a high-vaulted space designed to make the being standing at its center feel small, and the being seated at its apex feel large. Daventhrel sat at the apex. He was a Cassivy, which meant he was old in the way that geological formations were old, not merely aged, but stratified, each year visible in the layers of his coloring, the depth of his eyes, the particular weight with which he occupied space. "You've been pulling archive transmissions," he said, not a question. "Yes, Executor Prime." "The Vasquez communication." "Among others." He was silent for a moment, and in that silence Keth Soren heard something she hadn't expected to hear from the most powerful military administrator in the Cooperative. The sound of a person deciding how honest to be. "I saw that transmission before the Armada launched," he said. She kept her expression neutral with the practiced effort of long experience. "You saw it." "I believed it was a bluff, a psychological tactic. Humans use those." A pause. "I still believe it may have been a bluff." "Executor Prime, 412 ships." "I know." "With crews." "I know, analyst." His voice carried something now that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger. That is why you are here. I need to understand what happened before anyone else decides what to do about it." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "that 3 member species of the cooperative have already submitted formal proposals to the Council. 2 of them recommend immediate maximum force escalation. One of them recommends what the filing calls *unconditional framework withdrawal." Kethsorin translated that, surrender. The word used was *withdrawal. "But that's what it means." He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. She left the chamber with 2 new questions burning behind everything else she was trying to hold in order. What had the humans actually done to 412 warships? And why, if they had done it, if this capacity existed, had they waited so long? Why allow the Armada to assemble? Why allow it to cross Threshold 7 at all? Why not demonstrate the capability earlier, before 18 months of failed negotiations, before the assembly at Docking Cluster 9, before Elena Vasquez had to write an apology for a catastrophe that hadn't happened yet? Unless... Kethsorin stopped walking in the middle of the corridor and stood very still, and felt the particular cold of a thought arriving before she was ready for it. Unless demonstrating the capability earlier would have required them to use it. Unless Threshold 7 was *chosen, was a corridor the humans had specifically allowed the Armada to enter because Threshold 7 had something the open territories didn't. She pulled up the stellar cartography on her personal display and looked at Threshold 7's position. A narrow corridor between 2 dense asteroid fields, sensor occluded from 6 different standard approach vectors, gravitationally complex enough to make emergency exit calculations difficult even for ships that weren't under fire. A perfect trap. Not a defense, not a reaction. A trap that the humans had constructed and then waited for 18 months for the cooperative to walk into. The coffee cup spun in her memory, intact, unhurried, waiting for someone to return. She found the first timestamp inconsistency at hour 47 of her analysis. It was buried in the Armada's own navigation logs, which the cooperative had partially recovered from a handful of vessels whose data cores had survived the debris field more or less intact. The logs showed normal transit through the outer approach to Threshold 7, normal formation integrity, normal communication cadence between command ships, everything routine, everything unremarkable. Until 3:47 shipboard standard time, when the logs showed an 8-minute gap. Not a malfunction, not a recording error. The surrounding data was clean, the timestamps contiguous in every other respect. 8 minutes of navigation log simply did not exist, as though someone had reached into the data stream and removed them with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were removing and exactly why. 8 minutes was enough time, Kethsorin calculated, for a crew of any species to notice something wrong and fail to report it before something worse happened. She cross-referenced against the communication logs and found 4 transmissions from that 8-minute window, 4 separate ships attempting to contact cooperative command outside the corridor, that had never arrived. That had been sent, logged as sent at the originating vessel, and then ceased to exist somewhere between transmission and receipt. Someone had jammed them, from inside the corridor, which meant there was something inside Threshold 7 capable of targeted communication suppression across 412 warships simultaneously, that had activated precisely 8 minutes before whatever had destroyed every ship in the Armada and had left no wreckage of its own. She stared at this for a long time. Then she went back to the list of what the debris field did not contain. No human remains, no human ship wreckage, no evidence that any human military vessel had been in Threshold 7 at any point during the 11 days the Armada was in transit. The trap didn't require humans to be present. The trap had been waiting there, already built, already armed, requiring nothing except the Armada's arrival and 8 minutes of silence. How long had it been there? She submitted the question as an internal query with the highest security classification she had access to, and received an automated response that the query had been logged and would be reviewed. 30 minutes later, she received a second notification informing her that her security clearance had been temporarily elevated by direct order of Executor Prime Davin Threll. Then she received the actual answer. The earliest sensor ghost consistent with a constructed structure inside Threshold 7, dated to 4 years before the Armada launched. 4 years before the resource negotiations had even formally begun. 4 years before the first diplomatic cable, before the first disputed boundary marker, before any public indication that the relationship between the cooperative and humanity was deteriorating. 4 years. Keth Soren sat with this for a very long time, let it expand into all the spaces it needed to occupy. The implications were not subtle. The humans had not built the trap in response to the Armada. They had not built it in response to the negotiations. They had not built it in response to anything the cooperative had done. They had built it 4 years before any of those things existed, and then conducted 18 months of good faith negotiations, or what had appeared to be good faith negotiations. While it sat waiting in a corridor, they had apparently decided, 4 years in advance, that a cooperative armada would one day use. She thought about Elena Vasquez's 6 sentences. We have considered all of the options available to us and have made our decision. When had they made the decision? Before the negotiations started, before the first territorial dispute, before any of this had become visible from the outside. How long had the humans been looking at the cooperative and seeing exactly this future, moving toward it with the patience of something that understood it could not stop the Armada from being built, only from surviving? The recording arrived on the 14th day of Keth Soren's analysis, and it was this, not the blast signatures, not the timestamp gap, not the 4-year construction ghost, that changed everything she thought she understood. It came from one of the recovered data cores, flagged automatically as non-navigation content, miscategorized as sensor calibration data, sitting in an unprocessed queue for 11 days because nobody had thought to look at recovered sensor calibration files from a destroyed Armada. Keth Soren almost didn't open it. She almost sent it to general processing and moved on to the atmospheric composition data from the debris field. She opened it. It was a video file, 31 minutes long, human format, aboard what appeared to be a human vessel, though one she couldn't immediately identify, clean lines, minimal visible equipment, the kind of aesthetic that suggested function over display. A single human sat in frame. A woman, middle-aged by human standards, brown hair pulled back with the utilitarian lack of ceremony of someone for whom appearance had become irrelevant to the work at hand. She was looking directly into the recording device. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said. "This recording is addressed to whoever is conducting the post-event analysis for the Galactic Cooperative." Keth Soren went very still. "I want to explain some things that the evidence alone won't tell you. Not because I think you deserve an explanation. I'm genuinely uncertain about that. But because I think not understanding what happened here is more dangerous for everyone than understanding it, and I'd prefer the galaxy to be less dangerous. That's always been my preference. That preference is, as you may have gathered, why I'm in this line of work." A pause, a very human kind of pause, not the silence of someone choosing words, but of someone allowing the space for what they're about to say to matter. The installation in Threshold 7 took 6 years to build, not 4. You found the earliest ghost at year 4 because that's when the primary emitters came online. The foundational infrastructure, the anchoring systems, the power substrate, the comm suppression lattice, that's from year 6 before you're watching this. We started building it before your cooperative had filed a single formal boundary complaint. We started building it because someone read the trajectory of the resource competition and understood where it led, and decided that if it was going to end here, It should end in Threshold 7 instead of in orbit around one of our inhabited worlds. She leaned forward slightly. I want you to understand what that means. It doesn't mean we're prescient. It doesn't mean we have some strategic genius that transcends your own. It means we ran the same models you ran, read the same pressures you were feeling, and arrived at the same conclusion, that this was probably going to come to force. The difference between us and you isn't that we saw it coming. You saw it coming too. The difference is what each of us decided to do with that knowledge. You built an Armada. We built an exit. The 31 minutes of Elena Vasquez's recording would later be classified at the highest possible cooperative security level, and a formal committee would spend 4 months debating whether it should be destroyed entirely. Keth Soren knew this because she was one of the 3 analysts who argued against destruction, and she lost that argument 2 votes to 1. She also knew, though she told no one, that she had already transmitted a full copy to 17 separate archive nodes across the cooperative's network before the classification order arrived. She had done this without hesitation. She had surprised herself. But it was what Vasquez said at minute 19 of the recording that she couldn't stop returning to, that woke her in the sleep cycles that followed and sat behind every thought she had about everything else. I know what you found in the debris field, Vasquez said. I know what's missing. You're asking where the remains are. You're asking where our ships are. You're asking why there's no human wreckage. She was quiet for a beat. The people who built Threshold 7, the engineers, the planners, the ones who anchored the comm suppression lattice and calibrated the primary emitters, some of them stayed, to be certain it worked correctly. You understand what I'm telling you. They stayed inside the corridor. They were there when the Armada arrived. Keth Soren had watched this section 6 times. We don't have remains because we didn't make recoverable remains possible. The installation doesn't leave those. Everyone who stayed to operate it understood that. They made that choice, individually, with full information, without coercion. We don't have a word that translates cleanly into your language for what that is. The closest approximation would be something like asterisk guardianship, but that doesn't capture it entirely. I'm not asking you to admire it. I'm not asking you to understand it. I'm asking you to consider, as you make your next decisions, what it means that we had people willing to do that. Not because they were ordered to. Not because they had no other option. Because they looked at the alternative 412 warships reaching inhabited human space, the casualties that would follow, the cities, the children, and they made a calculation that your models aren't built to accommodate. We've made that calculation before. We'll make it again if we have to. I genuinely hope we don't have to. The Cooperative Council convened in emergency session on the 19th day after Keth Soren's initial report, and she was summoned to present her findings to a chamber that had never, in her 22 years of service, felt so airless. 7 species, their representatives arranged in the tiered seating of the council chamber, a room built specifically to hold the weight of civilization-level decisions. Most of them were looking at her with the careful blankness of people who had decided their expressions before they arrived, and were maintaining those decisions by force of will. Davin Threll sat at the apex. He had read the Vasquez recording. She could see it in the particular quality of his stillness. She presented the facts in the order she had found them and let the order do the work. The blast signatures, the timestamp gap, the communication suppression, the 4-year ghost corrected to 6, the absence of human remains, the nature of the installation, the logical implications of pre-constructed infrastructure built before any visible cause for conflict. She left Elena Vasquez for last. The silence after she finished was the kind that has mass. They built it 6 years before, said the Hallan representative, a being who had spent 300 years in diplomatic service and was not given to visible emotional response. She sounded, Keth Soren thought, like someone who had just learned they had been walking above a collapsed mine for longer than they could calculate. Correct. Without knowing, the Armada would use that corridor. They appear to have considered it one of several probable vectors. There's evidence in Vasquez's recording that Threshold 7 was not the only installation. The chamber absorbed this. How many? Daventhrell said. I don't know, the recording doesn't specify. Vasquez said one of the exit points we prepared. Plural. Another silence, longer this time. They have been doing this, said the Varath representative slowly, his two wide eyes moving across the chamber, since before the negotiation began. Since before the dispute that led to the negotiation, Kethsorin corrected. The timeline suggests they began construction while the relationship between the cooperative and human territorial interests was still formally positive. They were preparing for a war while signing cooperative agreements. She hesitated. It was the first time in her presentation she had hesitated, and she saw every representative notice it. That's one interpretation, she said. Vasquez's framing suggests another. She describes it as building exits rather than weapons. The installation at Threshold 7 was entirely defensive in terms of territorial implication. It destroyed an invading force within a designated human boundary corridor, leaving no damage to cooperative claimed space. It required human personnel to sacrifice themselves inside it rather than survive to pursue the aggressor. She paused, found the words she needed. It has no offensive applications. You cannot use Threshold 7 to attack anyone. You can only use it to prevent an attack from succeeding. By destroying the attackers. Yes. That is not a distinction that restores 412 ships. No, Kethsorin agreed quietly, it isn't. The council voted that same day. The result was not publicly announced. The result, strictly speaking, was not publicly anything classified behind so many layers of institutional sealing that Kethsorin would not learn the formal numbers for 6 more years. What she learned immediately, because Daventhrell told her in the corridor outside the chamber with the weariness of someone who had lived long enough to recognize historical moments, and found they never felt the way he expected, was that the unconditional framework withdrawal proposal had passed. Not the escalation proposals, not the continued military pressure, not the blockade options or the territorial forfeiture demands, or any of the other mechanisms that represented variations on the approach that had already failed in a spectacular and irreversible fashion. The withdrawal. They're afraid, she said. She wasn't sure if she meant it as an analysis or a question. Yes, Daventhrell said, correctly I think. The humans haven't made any new demands. They haven't moved any forces. They haven't. That is also frightening. He looked at her steadily. The Armada is gone. The people who were on those ships are gone. The humans have issued no ultimatum, no declaration, no expanded claim. They sent us a recording of a woman explaining why she's sorry it happened. He paused. An apology issued before we asked for one, before we even finished counting what we lost. Kethsorin thought about the coffee cup, about the dark residue of a morning drink, spinning intact through wreckage. She knew we'd look for the recording, she said. Yes. She knew we'd find the installation data, the timestamps, the construction history. Yes. She wanted us to understand the full picture. She wanted us to know how long they'd been preparing, what it cost them to execute it, why they built exits instead of weapons. She felt the thought completing itself with a slowness that felt like falling. She wants us to be afraid. I believe, Daventhrell said carefully, that she wants us to be *informed. The fear is a consequence of the information, not a goal of it. There is a difference. He straightened, and she saw in his movement the weight of what he was about to say next. The humans understand that difference. That is the part that frightens me most. Kethsorin returned to her analysis bay, and sat in the particular silence of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not expect to reach, and is not yet sure how to inhabit it. She pulled up the debris field imagery one more time. Let it fill the display. 412 ships, or what remained of them, scattered across a corridor that was now. She understood, a kind of monument, not to human military power, not to victory, to something harder to name, the residue of a decision made by people who saw what was coming and chose not to flinch from the cost of preventing it. She found item 7C in the catalog, zoomed until the coffee cup filled the frame. It was still intact, still spinning, the dark residue at the bottom catching the ambient light in a way that made it look almost warm. She thought about the people who had stayed inside Threshold 7, who had anchored the lattice and calibrated the emitters and been there when the Armada arrived, knowing there was no exit for them, only the exit they were building for everyone else. She thought about what Vasquez had called it, guardianship, and the addendum that doesn't capture it entirely. No, she didn't think it did. She thought about the second installation, and the third if there was one. Corridors she didn't know yet, traps she couldn't find, built years before anyone asked for them by people who had looked at the galaxy's future and made their calculations quietly, without announcement, without the drama of ultimatum or the theater of deployed force. The cooperative had spent 18 months assembling the largest armada in galactic history. Humanity had spent 6 years building the room it walked into. And still, this was the part she kept returning to, the part that wouldn't sit still in her mind and be cataloged neatly, and still, Elena Vasquez had sent a message. One message, 6 sentences, a request to resume negotiations, an apology. They had built the room and they had still asked, one more time, if there was another way. The request had gone unanswered. The political division had logged it and moved on. And 43 days later, 412 warships had crossed Threshold 7, and 8 minutes after that, they were debris. And now the cooperative was withdrawing from every territorial claim within 6 light-years of human space, and 3 of the 7 member species had submitted informal inquiries about what it would take to establish formal non-aggression treaties. And Executor Prime Daventhrel was composing a diplomatic transmission that Keth Soren suspected he was struggling to write, because there was no adequate protocol for the thing he needed to say. We received your message. We did not answer it. We understand now what that cost. Somewhere in human space, Elena Vasquez was probably still working, processing forms, attending meetings, ensuring the machinery of continuity kept grinding, doing whatever the people who built exits did after the exits became unnecessary. Keth Soren hoped she had time for coffee. The formal historical designation assigned to the Threshold 7 event by the Cooperative Archival Commission, 3 years later, was the corrective engagement. The designation was changed 4 times before that one was settled on, each previous version rejected for reasons the Commission minutes recorded with the careful obliqueness of institutions trying not to say what they mean. The Threshold event was too neutral. The Vasquez incident was rejected because nomming it after a human put too much weight on a single individual in ways that misrepresented the nature of what had occurred. Operation First Warning was rejected, the minutes noted, because the evidence does not support the characterization of the event as a warning, as the term implies a communicative intent that is contradicted by the installation's technical specifications. The minutes did not record who had pointed this out, or whether the room had gone quiet when they did. Keth Soren read those minutes and thought about the objection, thought about it carefully. Because the installation wasn't a warning, it couldn't function as one, had never been designed as one, had been built 6 years in advance to be irreversible at the moment it became necessary. The warning had been 6 sentences long, sent by a mid-level functionary with no military rank, gone unanswered. The installation was something else. The installation was the humans' answer to a question no one had asked them yet. What happens to the civilization willing to continue long after every rational calculation says stop? Threshold 7 was the answer made physical, made permanent, made out of 6 years of quiet work and the choice of specific people who had looked at the cost column of that answer and signed their names next to it without being asked twice. The debris field persisted for years. Keth Soren received automated sensor reports from the monitoring buoys the cooperative eventually placed at a respectful distance. Respectful being the operative word, the decision having been made unanimously, and without significant discussion that no cooperative vessel would transit Threshold 7 for the foreseeable future. The coffee cup was still there. She checked occasionally, still spinning, still intact. Once, reviewing a sensor sweep in what passed for a quiet moment in her work, she noticed it had drifted slightly, a fraction of a degree over 6 months, orbital mechanics working their slow, patient geometry. In another 40 years, the modeling suggested, it would drift far enough to clear the debris field entirely, spinning out into open space, heading nowhere in particular with the unhurried confidence of something that had already survived everything it needed to survive. She marked this in her log and did not delete the entry. It was not, she understood, the most significant piece of evidence in the debris field. It was not strategically meaningful. It did not tell her anything about weapons systems or construction timelines or the location of other installations whose existence she was now professionally and personally certain of, sleeping in other corridors, waiting with the particular patience of things built by people who had learned to think in decades. But it was the first thing she had seen, and it was the thing she kept coming back to, because in all the strategic calculus of Threshold 7, the 6-year timeline, the sacrificed operators, the pre-negotiation preparation, the layered communication suppression, the impossible blast signatures, the coffee cup was the piece that felt most like a message. Not a warning, not a declaration, something quieter than either, something that said, we were here. We are ordinary people who do ordinary things and drink something warm in the mornings and set it down to attend to what needs attending to. And we built this. And we will build it again. And we are still here. The galaxy did not sleep easily after Threshold 7. New treaties were drafted. Old assumptions were quietly retired. The phrase, human territorial integrity, took on a weight in diplomatic language it had not previously carried, gaining the particular gravity of words that have been purchased rather than simply agreed upon. Several species that had been on the margins of the cooperative's Armada planning found reasons to revisit their participation agreements. Others, further out, who had watched the event from a distance with the careful attention of civilizations that understand trajectory, sent their own quiet inquiries toward human space, not ultimatums, not demands, but questions. The kind of questions asked by beings who have recognized, perhaps later than they should have, that something in the galaxy is not what they thought it was. The humans answered most of those inquiries, engaged in the conversations, resumed the resource negotiations under the original framework, as Elena Vasquez had requested, and reached workable agreements within 8 months. Trade resumed. The border markers were adjusted. The formal mechanisms of cooperative interaction continued, as formal mechanisms do, absorbing the enormous fact of Threshold 7 into their processes without being able to fully metabolize it. Keth Soren submitted her final analysis report on the 23rd day. It ran to 400 pages. Davin Threll read it in full, which she knew because he sent her a single-line acknowledgement when he finished. Thank you for not flinching. She did not know exactly what he meant. She thought about it for a long time. She thought he meant the coffee cup, the choice to log it, the choice to keep returning to it, the choice to let a small, intact, ordinary thing sit at the center of an analysis of something vast and terrible and complicated, because the small, ordinary thing was, in some way she couldn't fully articulate in the language of official reports, the point. The humans weren't the strongest species in the galaxy. The cooperative had species that were older, with deeper histories, larger fleets, more ancient technological traditions, longer institutional memories. The humans were not the fastest or the most diplomatically sophisticated or the most resource-rich or the most biologically durable. They were the species that had looked at what was coming, 18 months before it arrived, 6 years before it arrived, really, if you counted from when the building started, and had made their decision and set down their coffee and gone to work. They were the species that had people willing to stay inside Threshold 7. Not because those people had no choice. Not because the system demanded it or the command structure required it or the survival calculus left no other option, but because they had looked at the alternative and made a different calculation than any system Keth Soren had ever studied was built to predict. That was the part that would not leave her. That was the part she suspected would not leave the Cooperative Council, or Davin Threll, or the species that had submitted their quiet inquiries from the margins, or anyone who had read the analysis carefully enough to reach the part about the people who stayed. Not can they win? The question that would live in the corridors of the cooperative for a generation, unspoken in official chambers but present in every strategic conversation, every new Armada proposal that was drafted and quietly shelved, every territorial calculation that now included a new variable no model had previously accommodated, was simpler and stranger and far more difficult to answer. How much are they willing to lose? And behind that, are they counting? The coffee cup spun in the dark, 40 years from settling, unhurried, heading nowhere in particular. The silence it left behind,